And then these are all the same as well, except these are the drawings. They're straight music and drawing. Okay, so you've got two separate sort of concepts in both those.
Yeah.
And then you've got where you were, almost where we were today, but that's pilling. It's a similar kind of studies for something. And I'll get rid of the rest.
Yeah.
Yep.
These are to do, if you like, with sounds associated with that part of that drawing. So they're always related upwards. As you scan across, you're going to get different sounds. You know, on your left you have a sort of orchestral variety of different kinds of sounds. In the middle you have another lot of sounds, and this way you're going further into the distance, the sounds get quieter and or more complicated. So that's why you've got this kind of phasing. But then that develops into a much more pictorially realised thing. We did some modelling today, actually at Hest Bank on Morecambe Bay, blustery, very active sea, high tide, the rocks and the sand grinding together as waves came in and fell back. In a field situation, I've got two choices. If it's really comfortable and fairly static, I can sit for half an hour or an hour and make a drawing. But if it's very dynamic or uncomfortable or whatever, or I want to capture something which is momentous, I've got to do a quick drawing. So in fact, the drawing I'm looking at right now is a drawing I was able to do in 5 minutes. In fact, the base of the drawing was done in about 60 seconds, which I can then fill a little bit in as well. I had time and enough comfort while sitting there to actually make just one notation of one single wave hitting the beach. So I've got a percussion sound of the rolling of the wave when it actually hits the beach, the breaking sound of the actual impact between the wave and the rocks, and then the sucking sound as it goes back. Now, that only took me 5 minutes. But here, back in the studio, so we've gone from field, which is what this is, the real thing, what French Impressionist painters called plein air, outside. I've come back into my studio, and then I have a studio drawing. And this studio drawing is much more refined, it's much more detailed, it's much more pictorially realistic. This took me about 20 minutes to make the drawing. And I've been able to go much further and more, in a more elaborate way, into the notation of that single wave drop. Now, this may produce, what's this taken me? 35 minutes to do these two processes of drawing. That may lead to about 11 seconds of music. So, you know, the relationship between field work and the stuff you're going to produce is kind of exponentially smaller. You know, the results of the field experience will become smaller. But the great thing about being in this habitat is, as you can see all around me, are the tools with which I can translate my sensation into a meaningful way of being read by somebody else, i.e. you, the onlooker, and also the musician looking at my music. I noticed in part one and part two that when you were asking me questions, I kept reaching for something to one of these. You know, I think I had a biro or something I was reaching for. It's just common nature for me to actually think through my fingers, through my hands. You know, I talked about, I think in part two, about snatching sounds from the air and getting it into my shoulder, in my arm, and into the pencil and onto the paper. This is the same thing with changing the sense of seeing, being there, into a meaningful notation. You know, when Heather and I lived in France, we lived near Lascaux, which is one of the great cave galleries. I've forgotten how old it is, 7,000 years plus. The walls are covered in drawings, paintings, bison, horses, human figures. Why do they do that? It's field to studio. These galleries, these dark caves which they lit only with the aid of a shoulder bone of an ass filled with animal fat. No big searchlights or flashlights like we've got now, but just that. Nevertheless, they're taking the experience of something visual, something to them, magic, of religious importance. They're taking the field experience into their studio, which happens to be I guess, like a church. It's a religious place. And I think these things, for me, are symbolic of the process of using my senses in a primal way, actually in field, and bringing them back into here, because I am, in the end, a composer. I am going to play with sound. And although, people making film of me being a composer, unlike a lot of composers who I guess do spend a lot of time going clang, 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 clang on the piano, clang, 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 da, 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 I don't do that. So it makes a very boring film to watch me composing, because all you do, there's no noise at all, except if you got very close, you'd hear the scratch of my pencil on the paper, or the pen on paper. But it's still magical. It still connected me with those Lascaux people, the Neanderthals or whatever, making their markings on surfaces in order to record their need to form a relationship of where they are and why they are where they are. I mean, I love the difference between this thing, with which I can only make black and white markings, and this little wonder. I mean, to me, that's like it's actually a flower pot, which Heather has painted. But these are like individual blossoms. They've all got their individual species of violets or pansies or whatever. With each of those, I can make a line which is a different colour from another one. So each of those has got an individual resonance to it. Now, that's like saying, if I use 12 different wind instruments in an orchestral piece, each of those are going to have different colours. They're all woodwinds, so you could say they're all forms of purple and pink and blue, but they're all different shades of purple, pink and blue. And what's more, each individual instrument can change its colour shading intensity. It can make the colours close to you, far away, looking at colours that way, or stretching them out through a musical line. If you do it that way, you're looking at individual musical notes, but the moment I tilt it that way, it starts to look longer, elongated through time. And that's a wonderful translation of the idea of a coloured point into a coloured line. And then, of course, you can look at it another way, and if I literally bundle them together like that, it produces clusters of colours of notes, which gives me a wonderful, exquisite chord of notes, all being played at the same time. And I think about these things all the time. That's why having this, for me, this is almost like a church. Yeah. People say, do I have a dialogue with God? We haven't talked about religion yet. I think I do have a dialogue with the God of nature. I suppose I'm a pantheist. Mm-hmm. The great mysteries, the great divinity, I suppose, of things, the unnameable, what we call the spiritual, the metaphysical, to me have to do with nature itself and the instruments by which and with which we respond to the natural world. Because the natural world isn't just out there, it's also in here. The connection between the wildness of what's out there is also a connection with the wildness that's in myself. I don't think I've said this before since we started these series, but I probably do my best music when I'm not too sophisticated, when I'm not too human, not too well-trained, not too clever.
It's almost as if you've got all the knowledge and all the tools that you need, that you can just trust it and just let it happen naturally, without overthinking it.
That's a really good observation. You asked me about books. Why do I have these books? They are the kind of seed bed. They're the eggs of knowledge. But they won't hatch unless I actually change those eggs into a working process. There's an animal called the caddisfly. And the caddisfly has got various stages in its life. Its larval stage, before it can fly, is underwater. And it's got a very, very, what's the right word? Vulnerable, susceptible to attack skin. No real protection at all. So what does it do? It walks around on the bottom of the stream or the lake or whatever, and because it's got a sticky back, it literally fastens itself to anything where it's going and picks up bits of stone, bits of shells, bits of plants. It's fantastic camouflage. But what's it doing if you think of the shell, the casing of the caddisfly larva, it's its life history. You know, I went there and I got this, and I went there and I got that. These are the things, these are part of my caddisfly journey of collecting experiences, because not only do I love collecting things in the field, as everyone will now know, but I also love collecting things in there. And the great thing about all of these is that each of these books are kind of like microcosmoses. Whether it's a book on Mozart opera or Boulez talking about the structure of music, or a book on butterflies and moths, or a book on Manet, the French Impressionist painter, or books on visual perception, or books on the mathematics of complexity, a book on moths, some work by Bach about flowers. All of these represent a chance for me. If I'm sitting there over there drawing, which we'll look at in a little while, I may think, oh, wait a minute, I've just experienced a moth flying somewhere. What was that moth? So I look through my shelves until I find the book on moths, which I need, and I pull it down and look at it, and it gives me a more intense understanding. I mean, the more you know about what it is that you're representing. I mean, I don't know how a painter could paint a portrait of anybody or anything unless they know that thing. So I imagine the best portrait painters ask questions, or they confront their sitter in such a way. This, for me, how can I put this? It's actually a form of armouring myself. You know, I feel vulnerable without knowing enough about what it is I'm trying to put into music. So that's why I have books. And these ones in my studio here are probably the foreground, the most important books. They're the ones I'll keep wherever I go, like the caddis. So they're the things I sort of clothe myself in. When I walk into my studio, I don't have that much different feeling from when we were all walking on Hess Bank. Because this room is full of organic, natural, formal, dynamic, time-spun, colour changed, sets of imaginative possibilities. And they're inviting me to have another set of responses, because in fact I visually respond to my studio. That's why over there I have a composing table on which I do most of my drawing. There, which you can't see in shop, which is another table looking at actually the next stage, which is the computer realizations of my music. Here is the direct translation zone between what I've experienced, as we did together, all of us, in the field this morning, and what's come on to paper here, and still only in black and white.
So at what point will that become the tones and the colours that you mentioned, or does that just happen when it happens?
When I turn the page. I would have no time to do it now, but if I turn that page, I can translate the black and white experiences from the quick sketch to the longer, more detailed sketch. These are all reinforcing memories. I mean, there were birds that flew by while we were taking the filming out there. There were goosanders that flew by, oyster catchers that flew by. They had voices. The wind was making sounds. The grass clattering was making sounds. The waves banging on the beach. Even a passing train behind us, the big railway line up to Lancaster and down south to London, they're all making sounds. They're all back here, absolutely back here and absolutely alive. So, yeah, when I turn the page, I'll go to these. I'll go to the colours, because those two, the colours of the sound, the shapes of the sounds, are imprinted in my mind. It is, in a weird sort of way, the studio is also a kind of field. Because field's got lots of meanings. It's not just a place like where cows graze or sheep graze. Field means an area. Field of knowledge, field of experience, fielding a cricket ball, the fielder. They're all to do with dynamic interactions with things. And I feel that my studio is yet another field. In a weird sort of way, actually, I think what happens is that as a result of going from field to studio, when I go back from studio to field, I'm carrying a studio experience back into the field, and it intensifies the experience. You know, a great writer, thinker, scientist actually, playwright, philosopher, Goethe, once said there are 3 stages to perception. The first thing is you look at the whole of something. So if we're looking about this space, I invite you looking at this film to look at this entire space. Everything. Me, what's surrounding me, what's through that window, what's going on. That's Goethe's first line of perception. The second line of perception is to look at the detail. Look at that colour, that form, this pencil, my hand, my nose, my eyes, that window, those trees, that colour sky, this background, those forms, what's on the wall, every single detail. That's stage 2. Third stage is look back at the thing in the large again. What's happened? You looked at the parts of the whole as well as the whole. So when you look at the whole again, you've got both. You've got a consciousness of the entire effect and all the things that go up to make it one whole thing. And I think that's why drawing towards music, for me, represents a continuum. It's cyclic. You know, because I'd have to say this conversation is about from field to studio. But you know what the best way of saying this? From field to studio, to field to studio, to field to studio, to field to studio, to field to studio. Somewhere, if I don't do that, nothing's going to happen. I've got to stop it and say field to studio, field to studio, field to studio, compose. And that's when I move from this to my piano, to my composing table, and all this experience, thank you, Goethe, has given me an absolutely comprehensive, full experience, enough to make the sound animate, to have meaning, to have shape, to have emotion, to have reactions, and above all, oh please, above all, to be new, to be fresh, to be alive.
So what is it that triggers you to go from field? What is it that makes you go, right, that's it, I'm sitting at the piano now?
Good question. I've got an answer. It's when you reach a state of enoughness.
How do you know?
Instinct. The human imagination, the human mind is a vessel in a way. I mean, that can only contain so many pencil shavings. A teacup can only contain so much tea. A wine vat can only contain so much. An ocean can only contain so much water. You can't. I mean, it's theoretically we are experiencing global warming, and the oceans are being distorted by an unhealthy and damaging, perhaps catastrophic, change in temperature, which is melting the great polar ice caps. And because the Pacific is designed to have so much water in a balanced state, you unbalance it, it's going to change the container. So how do I know when to go to the music and leave all this alone? When the vessel of my experimenting, of testing, of drawing, of visualization, of considering, of imagining, of analysing, of speculating, has reached a point where I'm just too full, there's too much. You've got enough. It's the enoughness that I talked about. And that's what happens when I go to there. Then, funnily enough, it starts all over again, because you've got all this fat stuff, but suddenly you've got a blank piece of paper with nothing on it. All this is full. All that represents fullness, but that's just blank paper. But I don't have a blank head. I don't have a blank inner ear. It's already stuffed full of possibilities. And what do again? I get out the butterfly net of my imagination and catch these flapping, dancing butterflies of sound. And let's say butterflies fly in shapes. And they begin to impose on me, or suggest, or coax, or seduce, invite me to respond, and to put them onto a two-dimensional surface. It looks like it's two-dimensional. let's talk about that in a future conversation, but it looks like it's two-dimensional because there is only a left and a right and an up and down, and in that sense it's flat. Manuscript paper looks flat, but it ain't. They actually symbolise 4 dimensions.
I want to know more about that now.
Well, I mean, we'll go into it in a lot more detail, but basically, the up is how many instruments are played at any one time. So if you think of them all like that, they're all standing on top of each other. So you've got the vertical, you've got the horizontal because they move, because an instrument, if you is more or less vertical, but is horizontal. Okay, so you've got that. You have depth, which is the 3rd dimension, because it can be so it's quiet. These things give you a sensation of closeness and distance, just like lines of perspective. It's lovely that the sign for getting louder and getting softer are a shape like that or that. Which is the same as in visual perception, the lines of perspective. Isn't that a beautiful analogy? Isn't that a beautiful likeness, togetherness? So yeah, I use that a lot.
When you come and sit down and you're full and you're ready to catch the butterflies and put it down, how do you decide which instruments you utilise for the sounds that you're catching?
Again, a really good question. There are lots of ways a composer will be compelled or even ordered, in a sense, to choose. If a pianist asks me to write a piano piece, I ain't going to write a piece for tuba or a clarinet or a harp. If a guitarist asks me to write a guitar piece, I'm not going to write a piece for trombone. So you see, in that situation, you're forming a direct relationship with a player of a particular instrument. And I suppose with chamber, most of the chamber music I've written has been for people I know. Mm-hmm. So if it's a string quartet, I can't write for double bass because the string quartet has 2 violins, a viola and a cello. If I write a piano quintet, by tradition, there will be a pianist, but there'll also be a string quartet. Mm-hmm. If I write a wind quintet, there's going to be a flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon and horn.
So do you actually start with, I know this musician, I'm going to write a piece for them, I'm going to catch sounds in my mind that I think would best lend themselves to them as a performer, player, instrumentalist, or are they together as one, or does one influence the other, or?
Yes and yes. I mean, I think that the privilege, actually, for a composer to work with a musician that he or she knows. And when I say know, there are 2 kinds of knowing. You know them as a person, and you know what they can do as players. It's a privilege, because that already suggests the do's and don'ts. At the same time, it also provokes big questions. What if? I know this pianist can play Messiaen. I'm working with a great pianist, Roderick Chadwick, who's already recorded 2 enormous big pieces of mine, for whom I'm writing 3 piano sonatas. I think after those, many hours of listening to him playing my music and the recordings, I think I know quite a lot about how he plays the piano. The what if is, what if I make him do something different, or a bit more provocative? What if I write rhythms which are more incisive than anything he's done so far? What if I want him to make a noise which is so shocking that it doesn't appear in a Beethoven sonata or the Messiaen for which he's so famous, or even the Cowie he's played before? What if I find something which is going to take him to a new level? Sometimes the collaboration is so beautiful, the player actually suggests to the composer, have you thought about this? And if it's a flautist or whatever, they'll say, if I sing this, I'm playing a note with my mouth on the flute, but if I sing at the same time, look what happens. And they blow across the mouthpiece and they sing something and this exquisite chord appears. Now, I wouldn't know that. I mean, these are called advanced or alternative techniques. And they're just like, they're saying, you didn't know there was a brown in my palette, did you? You know, you're just busy using purples and blues. I've got a brown one, or I've got a white one, or a black one. That's fantastic. But your original question, how do you select what instruments are going to do what? That becomes particularly important if you're writing for large vocal forces, a big choir with, say, 70 voices or even 28 voices, or even 16 or 12 voices, let alone a symphony orchestra with 130 players, and perhaps what? Especially if you've got multi-percussion, different percussions, 60, 70 different kinds of instruments. What do you select? It selects you, I think. You've got this basic idea. You know, Bach, a lot of Baroque composers didn't even specify what instruments would play their music. The Art of Fugue, one of Bach's great masterpieces, doesn't have piano at the head of the score, or harpsichord, or voices, or 4 trombones. It's just the music. You don't know. For me, I think I did say that some of these sounds don't care about me. They're just there, you know. And I think I mentioned somewhere that it might be a particular instrument, it might be voices, or not at all. And I have to say, what is that suggesting to me? I mean, again, you know, if I'm writing music about birdsong, why haven't I written a piece for double bass about birdsong? Because birds, even the lowest note any bird can sing would be in the very upper register of a double bass. I'm not saying I couldn't write a piece about birds for double bass, I certainly could, but they'd be stretched way up their fingerboard and it'd nearly all be harmonics that they're playing. So the double bass player said, look mate, you'd have been better off writing this for a bleeding violin rather than making me stretch all the muscles in my hand all the way up there. Or, Edward, I can't produce the colours I know you want. Yeah. You've written a piece here called Reed Warbler. Now, I happen to be a bird watcher, okay? I play the double bass, but I happen to be a bird watcher. No way, mate, am I going to be able to produce the colours of sound of a Reed Warbler on my double bass. It's a challenge, but I don't think I can do it. A flute player would say, no problem. Clarinet player, no problem. Violin, which has got very high notes, no problem. A singer might say, oh, you want a warbling sound? I can do that. You want a sharp ticking sound? I can do that. That's the way it goes. So that's why I say it's a combination between the instruments choosing me, if the players are specific and they want a piece, or if I have a very strong sense through this process, field to studio to composing board, that's the right instrument to produce that colour, that effect, in relation, especially if it's more than one instrument, in relation to another instrument. You might as well have asked me, when I'm drawing leaves on a tree, which of those do I use? Which combination? Do I use that leaf green? Do I use a sage green? Depends. If the tree happens to have 5 different greens on it, I'm going to have 5 instruments to do it. If a bird produces not just one kind of sound, but a group of sounds, you have to make the instrument, a single instrument, change those sounds. Or, if you detect 5 discrete different kinds of sound colours and sound worlds, you choose 5 instruments. It's a big question. I will talk about that later on in some other conversation.